Hello, void and all who inhabit it. It's me, and I am a superstitious scaredy cat. As I mentioned in previous videos, I am not a connoisseur of horror films. Scary is not my ministry. But I had recently been convinced into watching the 1992 and 2021 Candyman films, and I have a couple of questions. Being me, I looked up more about the story, including reading the original short story and attending a panel held by the Chicago History Museum, and the questions still remain. So I bring them to you in hopes that maybe we can figure some of this out. The 1992 film is based off of the 1985 short story The Forbidden by Clive Barker. Set in a Liverpool housing estate, the story creates a forum for discussions about class disparities. The film series, in shifting the location to Chicago's Cabrini Green housing projects, adds a layer of race to the discussion. However, the shifts in media also change what makes the apparition scary and how. In the short story, the community is in on what the specter is doing. At the end, it suggested that Anne-Marie sacrificed her child, an act that the entire estate was okay with because doing such a thing meant that they could continue living under relative comfort. It's not clear why the estate feels like they need to regularly make sacrifices, but we are left knowing that they do. When the films shift Mr. Sweets into a threat that the whole community is afraid of, as opposed to at least being willing to work with, what gets sticky is the connection between the specter and the community. The 92 movie, written and directed by Bernard Rose, presents a read from Helen's point of view of the man as a coping mechanism for all things bad. Movie Helen feels she's cracked the code of how this community deals with its trauma. She is more savior adjacent and less of a blatant participant in a hood safari than short story Helen in this way. But both stories filter the community through the lens of an outsider dropping in and condensing everything for her understanding. Helen's viewpoint also leads to her major conflict with Mr. Sweets as she doubts his legacy, but the through line of what he means to the community and what the community means to him is dropped to focus on Helen. I think Nia DaCosta in the 2021 film tried to unfold more of the impact on the community, but she did so in a direction that didn't make sense to me given what we are starting with. Hello from the editing kitchen once again. Something that I'm not going to go in depth about, but I feel is important to mention, is the fact that there are tons of horror fans, writers, enthusiasts who watched the initial 92 film, grappled with it, and created entirely new interpretations of this figure and what he means both to them and to the Black community at large. And that's dope, because that energy is what led to the decision to create a 2021 sequel. That energy is what led to the creation of the companion guide. But if you are not one of those people, or you are not well versed in these discussions that people have been having for 20 plus, almost 30 years, wow. Almost 30 years about this film and Black horror and Black characters in horror films and stories, the conclusion that those people and that community and those conversations have drawn is not inherently clear in this film. And I also think that's part of the issue in the new interpretation, is that if you haven't been aware of those conversations, it didn't make sense to make this jump. And I don't think you should need supplementary material to necessarily understand an initial piece of media beyond the first film if it's a sequel. Even if you like that, you shouldn't need it for it to make sense. And I feel like for this movie, you need the companion guide for it to make sense, for some of the leaps they're making to make sense, which to me, again, is not narratively strong, even if it is very pedantically clear what the message they're trying to send you home with is. The story goes from living metaphor to cautionary tale to anti-hero savior figure as we learn more about the man and later the men behind the moniker. The thing is, cautionary tales are meant to leave the audience with some type of message, normally by marking something as dangerous or explicitly labeling something as taboo. But the moral left with the audience at the end of the 2021 film is murky as fuck. Between and within these three versions of the story, we get three clashing meanings of who this being is supposed to be. The first is that this specter haunts a specific area for a specific reason. The second is that the name of said specter can be seen as invoking the memory of any Black man who's been the victim of racialized violence. And the third is that this is simply a summonable boogeyman. When I reached the end of the 92 version of the film, I immediately thought of Sam the Onion Man and Kate Barlow from Holes, a historical interracial love story that ends in pain and suffering, you know? A major difference between the two is that Kissing Kate lived on to be the name to invoke fear, not Sam. However, the lasting impact of Sam's memory and spirit is central to the story, just not as a thread of fear. Green Lake dried up after Sam's death. At the end of the story, it's not Stanley breaking his family curse that leads to rain, but the warden's family line being served justice as Stanley and Zero find the treasure that they wanted that brings rain. But again, it's Kissing Kate whose name lives on in history, whose name brings fear because she is seen as this unhinged woman who is killing good men out of greed and no other reason, seemingly. The structure of Holes as a story lets us see Kate's background, how she got this way, and how Sam is erased from her history in favor of the construction of her by people within the story, again as this unhinged, violent, irrational woman who cursed this small town. What's interesting in this is that the town of Green Lake places the onus of their curse on Kate and not on their treatment of Sam. They failed to recognize that a complicit community receives a communal consequence. But also, Kate went on to be a specific threat for a specific population. Compare all of that to Daniel Robitaille, whose backstory is like the C-plot of the 92 movie. He's your friendly neighborhood boogeyman. The threat of death, and a gory, violent death at that, is horrifying, of course, but there's no additional layer of he is tormenting this specific group for this specific reason. Additionally, we don't see how the aftermath of his death led to the creation of this community figure in comparison to somebody like Kate, or even maybe a better example would be Freddy Krueger. Before becoming a literal nightmare, Freddy Krueger was a serial killer. It's established that children already fear him, and that fear is something he's able to capitalize on once he becomes a wraith from hell. What transforms Daniel Robitaille into the terror of Cabrini Green? And I don't mean his death, or more specifically his final resting place. I mean what in the community, within his society, led to his uneasy soul deciding to rise up to do this here? What is his existence the communal consequence of? And are the people of Cabrini Green the ones who should be experiencing that consequence? I recognize that part of any urban legend like this, is made so terrifying by the fact that anyone could be killed simply by knowing of this figure and performing the right steps. But at the same time, this story is openly framed as social commentary. The original story was looking at class, the films are looking at class and race and later gentrification. That's a bit different from a figure like Jason, who initially wanted revenge, but then shifted into deciding that his hands are rated E for everybody in this particular radius. And even that change happened after we're given a clear understanding of who Jason is and the motivation behind his actions. The same cannot be said for the beekeeper, especially when you layer in the idea that his existence and his behavior is meant to serve as social commentary. What are you saying about race and poverty and violence when the black best friend of your white main character gets killed trying to protect and help said main character? When the end of your story pulls a haunted mansion and reveals that the brutalized black boogeyman sees his long-lost love in the white lady that went stomping through the community, dredging up trauma for a thesis. Actually, speaking of that, sidebar, both of these movies have at least one scene where a white woman is killed via invoking Mr. Sweet's name as a daring taboo thing. Both of the scenes I'm thinking about are also sexually charged, although there is a scene in the second movie where a group of teenage white girls do the whole mirror thing at a school. Regardless, the adult white women, well, the babysitter isn't an adult necessarily, we don't know. The sexualized white women wanting to do this taboo sex-connected act could be seen as a metaphor of wanting to partner with a black man, a similar taboo act. And in that, maybe there's some layered, questionable vengeance towards white women going on here. But Robitaille, the OG triple OG, was in love with his ye old white lady in a seemingly reciprocal relationship. So if we're meant to read that relationship in a similar lens as Kate Barlow and Sam the Onion Man, the villain is not the white lady who he partnered with, but the white men who murdered him and the community that stood by and did nothing. But again, how much of Robitaille's backstory is connected to who he becomes, beyond giving a physical description of who he becomes? How much of his end drives his behavior? Or is his backstory just the most gruesome way they could think to create this terrifying being? Hold that thought, we'll come back to it later. Back to the idea of having a social commentary connected motivation, the lack of this in the 92 film is also amplified by the shallow exploration of the modern day connection between Candyman and Cabrini Green. We miss so much potential depth of who he is and how he is seen by getting the story through Helen's point of view instead of Anne Marie's, for example. We know she's scared, but not how she or other residents came to this point of fear, of understanding that this is the reason behind your fear. And again, although a white community led to the murder of Robitaille, he haunts the hood. Who is his story meant to scare, and how in this way? If he is a cautionary tale for black people, why does his reanimation lead to killing more black people? Now, if Robitaille popped up to scare young black artists, for example, I think that would make sense. He could serve as a warning of what could happen to you. But that's not the role he serves. He becomes a catch-all for all inexplicable violence. As uncomfortable as it is, I think the short story had a clearer frame for the community's relationship to the specter. Just like the movie, the short story cares more about Helen. So we don't understand why, but we do learn that the residents of the Liverpool estate are willing to give the British boogeyman the blood that he wants. The short story specter is a curse on the estate community, a burden that they are struggling to deal with. His iconic lines, "I am the writing on the walls, I am the sweet smell of blood in the streets," makes more sense as a statement that he is a personification of the looming ever-present threat of violence and pain. The British boogeyman haunts the estates as a metaphor of real-life issues that haunt lower-income areas. So is that what Robitaille is meant to do? Is he the same metaphor? What then is the point of his relationship with Helen? And I keep bringing Helen up because the 92 movie is really about her. It's not about the titular character beyond his interactions with her. In the end, the explanation given of his existence is limited. with Helen deciding that the entity is a coping mechanism for violence-based trauma only. But the 2021 version suggests a different option entirely. The 2021 film follows Anthony McCoy, the baby who was kidnapped in the first film, now as an adult, obsessively researching the urban legend. Unlike the protagonist of the first film, who is effectively haunted by the apparition, Anthony will eventually become the next Captain Hook. The release of the film came with a companion guide. Monkey Paw Productions and Universal Pictures, in collaboration with Langston League and professors Tananarive Due and John Jennings, created an educational booklet that explores major themes in the second film and provides some dope resources. Towards the end of the guide, Jennings writes that Candyman is a system or a hive of tormented victims who now represent a dark and necessary strategy to resist violence and erasure of our experiences and collective humanity. Oh dang, I already said the word. The man can be anyone if the right circumstances occur at the wrong moment. As American history has shown us many times before, anyone can be the writing on the wall and be made the subject of another injustice. Coleman Domingo's character says something like this too, that we need this figure in the community, that this figure will always pop up. And the idea of potentially being next, so to speak, makes sense. But what isn't made clear is how the existence of this figure is transforming to be a resistance to violence. There's a scene at the end of the movie where Brianna, who is Anthony's girlfriend, calls on Captain Hook for help and he ends up slaughtering a whole bunch of cops. But there's a huge gap in how he switched to being this protector. You usually do not call on Mr. Sweets for help. You call on him when you want to die. Helen is protected, kinda, in the 92 film because of Robitaille's interest in her. But the 2021 film is now saying that this moniker can be a protector for any Black person. And that's only explored as an option in like the last 20 minutes of the film. The bulk of the movie dabbles in the same terrifying myth we already know. So I wonder if Candyman is an act against erasure, what memory is held in that title when it becomes a game for high schoolers? When such an entity can be summoned by anyone, the line between urban legend boogeyman and in-group metaphor or savior even starts to blur. Add on top of that it's not the names of the actual men that are used as calling cards, but rather this shared moniker. Helen's whole ass government name becomes a chantable means of murder by the end of the first film, but near nobody knows who Daniel Robitaille is. And we aren't sure how Anthony will be remembered by anyone other than Bree. I do want to note that there is an uncomfortable reality we have been contending with for the past couple of years, where real people's names have been invoked as talismans almost. The importance behind why it is crucial we remember these people as opposed to utilizing their likeness as signifiers of our own alleged goodness is lost. And while there is an ickiness there that can be explored, especially from a horror lens, I don't want to suggest a continuance of that behavior. Rather, I want to point to the difference between we need to remember these experiences and we need to remember the people who had these experiences. Making the name a label that can be attached to anyone does the first one, not the second, which, like, is there something lost in having a walking, breathing reminder of the outcomes of violence as opposed to the people who were lost? Like, that's my point here. Not that we should be chanting Daniel Robitaille's name in a mirror in order to get him to come out and kill people, but like, what are we trying to remember? And how exactly are we doing that if we condense all of these men to one metaphor? There's a scene where Domingo's character, William, tells the story of Sherman Fields, which shows that there is somebody who remembers the person. But William's end goal is to make a new story that can be absorbed into the same legend. So, do we care about the individuals as individuals or not? Actually, that character, William, doesn't make any fucking sense to me at all. If Mr. Sweets, as a label for anyone who has been victimized, can be seen as the product of systemic racism, why do you need to go out of your way to create another, newer version? Where is the recognition of Anthony's humanity and the manipulation of him as a tool of somebody else's design? William is the first person to treat the entity of Captain Hook as a viscera-fueled superhero. But again, he has never been that. And we don't see why this view of him has shifted. We are just told that it has. This plot feels like a harsh turn that was fueled, at least in part, by the weak foundation of the 92 film and a strong desire to make a story more connected to the community. Which I should like, right? Because that's all I was just harping about, the lack of community connection. But my thing is this. Is this being meant to be a personification of systemic environmental conditions that must be navigated for survival, or is he an amalgamation of several men who have perished due to said systemic conditions? And if he is the latter, what is the explanation for having killed the same people subjected to the same conditions? Now, Mr. Sweet's role can change, absolutely, especially because, again, the 92 version is so hollow. But Anne Marie McCoy, to this day, will not say his name. Bree and her brother both refuse to play the mirror game. Black people are not f***ing with the beekeeper, okay? That is a visceral fear that still lives. When and how does that shift for, at the very least, Bree? Bree loves Anthony, sure, but she's also terrified of him and what his obsession has created in him by the end of the film, or up until that last sequence, we'll say. Why would she then play the mirror game in order to be saved? For all the grief I have with the 92 version of this story, it did do a better job of building up why Helen would have reached the point to feel comfortable or desperate enough to have called on Robitaille for help. The 2021 shift in meaning from neighborhood terror to collective anti-hero feels empty, like more of a message than a full story. Earlier, I asked what is the connection between Robitaille's death and who he becomes. The 2021 film suggests that the link is the effect on us. The memories we do or don't hold of the Daniel Robitailles and the Sherman Fields and the Anthony McCoys creates this phantom who we in turn need so we don't forget. The in-film rationale behind the need for such a figure is flimsier than the importance of Anthony being the baby from the first movie. It's just there to be there, but the narrative connection is lacking. There's a Screen Rant article by Parik Coder about an early draft that had Helen as the villain of the sequel, and I wish they would have kept more of that story because it sounds like it would have made more sense. In this version, Anthony becomes obsessed with Helen because her own urban tale erases Robitaille's. It suggested, or at least my recollection suggested, that Anthony's driving force, which looks to have been shifted over to William, would have then been to create a new legend to reclaim the mantle in the process. They kept that desire to own the title, the story, the fear in William's character, but erased a strong motivation. At most, William has a heavy guilt connected to Sherman Field's death, but that isn't explored beyond providing an opportunity for heavy exposition. All the emphasis is on the name, and everything around it is a cardboard cutout of commentary, flat and dry. After reading the initial version of the story by Barker, I realized that the mirror aspect of the legend was added in the movie. While the estate is also afraid of saying his name out loud, there isn't a way to call a Candyman to you. He is an explanation, a coping mechanism, a tool for fear, but he shows up when he wants, not when you call him. As a result, the 5 times in the mirror thing changes the way that his story is spread and known. I mentioned before that I think the title loses power a little bit when it spreads as a game, but I think the mirror aspect also thins out the importance that he has to the neighborhood. Mr. Sweet's behavior is no longer Cabrini Green specific when he can terrorize anyone anywhere. In this regard, I think the 2021 film wants us to take away that his acts outside the community are where being an anti-hero of white supremacy come in. He's treated as a game, but arrives as genuine terror. And sure, killing the art critic could be read that way. But what is he meant to symbolize when he's slaughtering babysitters and 10th graders who know the name and not the story? Is there anything gained in that? Admittedly, on the other hand, there is a power to being remembered, to your name now having an effect on people, especially after your life was discarded like trash. At first, I was confused about the Say My Name marketing, but a consistent theme in all 3 versions is the need to be known, to be imprinted on memories for generations. And that's interesting. But it also brings us back to this split in meaning. Is Candyman a metaphor or a moniker? Is it important that we remember the system-wide issues or the specific victims? Does invoking his name remind us of either of those things, or does it just leave us too unsettled to say it too many times in a row on a YouTube video? Adding the aspect of him and his name also being a mirror game, I think undermines either option. As a metaphor, you're gonna, use your reflection to invoke the power of systemic oppression? That don't make any sense. And as a moniker, how is humanity remembered in utilizing a hive name as a scary game? Especially if the stories behind the hive name are lost in the process. The 2021 film kept really close to the structure of the first film and the original story by presenting an outsider who becomes increasingly invested in understanding this figure. The doubt and confusion around this summonable boogeyman is central to the creation of tension in these stories. But so much of the focus is on what these outsiders see, on their fear and understanding, or lack thereof, that the evolution and expansion of this terrifying being is being placed in the backdrop. And maybe I'd be more okay with that if the most recent film did not frame Mr. Sweets as the center and then failed to explore him, his title, and his legacy from a perspective any different from the ones we have seen before. Anthony did not grow up in Cabrini Green. The commentary is actually very similar to the short story in the sense that these middle to upper middle class people are looking at this poor community and being like, that's so absurd that you believe in this thing. And it's like starting from step 1 all over again of having to re-explain who this is instead of getting somebody who is already aware and wants to dive in deeper. I don't know, it just felt like a new coat of paint on an old statue with some glitter on top instead of, can you break clay and reheat it? Girl, I don't know, you can do that with glass. You can do that with glass. Instead of making a mosaic, you just put some chalk paint on a window and said it was something new when it's really the same shit. It just looks different. I feel the need to address the ever-familiar pitfall with Black media that we shouldn't criticize it because we have so few options, to which I call bullshit. I recently read an article that talked about television as a cultural forum, and the gist was that TV is not meant to be a perfect reflection of society. It's not a blueprint we should follow, but a text from which we can derive meaning. We can agree, disagree, or find entirely different interpretations of the message in the story, but the point is that the story, the entertainment media, is providing us the space to have conversations. Movies are doing the same. For this movie in particular, discussing who the titular character is and why he matters was an elemental part of the marketing, of the hype around the release, of the initial interest in a Black directed and written sequel. Having a follow-up conversation is not condemning the media, it is having a conversation, which arguably is the whole point in the first place. It's also worth mentioning that the first film was written and directed by a white dude from England. A lot of the weaknesses of the story, at least the cinematic version, start with the '92 film, which shifted from Liverpool to Chicago, added an extra axis of marginalization via race, and was written by somebody who mayhaps did not know the full scope of what he was talking about. The 2021 sequel has a clear desire to live up to the legacy of the 1992 film while course-correcting some of the major missteps of both that original movie and the story by providing a different perspective. But to me, that shift in meaning made the story too murky to enjoy without question or confusion. I waited until I got to this part of writing the script to look up more reviews, and I found 3 that both spoke to the narrative impact of being too blunt with social commentary. Blunt in a pedantic educational way, not a bold storytelling way. Ultimately, I think how strong you like your social commentary is at the crux of how you ingest this film series as a whole, but definitely the 2021 sequel. A lot of people will enjoy the pivot, will enjoy the explicit focus on the generational burden and fear that Black men have of becoming the next Candyman, will enjoy the similarities in marketing material and real-life social justice phrases. That plus nostalgia will make this film an excellent addition to many people's horror repertoire. But to nostalgia-free me, I wish both films leaned deeper into rounding out Robitaille and Anne Marie, had explored Cabrini Green as a home and not just an anthropological project, had figured out what Candyman as a figure means to the community that lives with him and how that would factor into revamping him as an anti-hero. At the end of the Chicago History Museum panel I attended, the panelists were asked for their definition of Black horror. Sherwin Ovid, a lecturer at Northwestern who also painted some of the pieces of the newest film, at one point said that horror relies on the unknown and the mystery. We're not meant to know everything that's going on, and that's part of what makes the story so uncomfortable. That's part of what makes the horror work. But there's a point where a story has too many gaps, where instead of creating tension, you've created plot holes. That has a noticeable impact on a story that's meant to move from menacing to meaningful. Neglecting to explore the evolution of the legend in favor of honing in on a message is a choice. I just think it's a weak one, even if the message is compelling. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. I try to come up with as many alternatives to as possible, so I could say it as little as possible, but my soul still might get yanked, so hopefully this actually gets published, you know what I mean? I hope y'all are enjoying spooky season. Even though I don't like horror movies, I love fall, and Halloween is my favorite holiday, so I'm very excited for all the ooky spooky shit coming out soon. Which reminds me, Venom comes out today. I don't know when this is getting posted, but it's October 1st. It's the most wonderful time of the year. And I'm very excited to go see Tom Hardy and his Demon Tongue Part 2. Anyway, back to this video. I love a good story, and I've always been irked by the idea that horror inherently isn't good, that it's not supposed to be cohesive or make you think, when actually it's often the opposite. And again, Gothic literature is like the foundation of a lot of horror. So like I can anticipate that a reaction to looking critically at something like this will be, it's a horror movie, it's not supposed to make sense. But that's not true. That's not true. Maybe I should have put this in the intro, because who's going to see this? But yeah, I just, that also really irked me when I got to the end of both films. And I was like, I hope no one's thinking, though I know someone is, that just because this is scary, it doesn't have to make sense, when that's not true. Horror movies are cheap to make, but low cost should not equate to low quality. Anyway, I'm going to go be an egghead somewhere else. So until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.